Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the 2017 Champions Showdown. We're going to be looking at day 3 today between Topalav and Nakamura. If you're not familiar with the Champions Showdown, you are matched up head-to-head against one individual. We have 4 matchups, 8 players in total, and you play that person for 30 games over a 4-day span. They range from rapid games. The first day they played 4 games of 30 minutes each. The next day, day 2, they played 6 games and they had 20 minutes. And then day 3, we're going to be playing 8 games and they only get 10 minutes. So this is getting into the blitz portion. Topalav had a rough couple days against Nakamura. He's down 3 games to Nakamura. And so we get into it. White's going to be played by Topalav in this game, and black's going to be played by Nakamura. Starts out with pawn to e4, and then pawn c5, knight f3, pawn d6, and this is the Sicilian defense. And specifically when we talk about the Sicilian defense, it really comes down to what black does, and he plays pawn to a6. This is the Najdorf defense. If you go back to day 2, we looked at the first game that Topalav played coming into day 2, and it was this. It was the pawn to e4 met by the Sicilian defense from Nakamura. And he saw the Najdorf, and he played a very specific move. He played pawn to f3, which is what he does now. Pawn to e6, bishop e3, pawn h5 from Nakamura. But today he plays queen to d2. In the game yesterday that he lost, coming out, he played this in game 1. He played bishop to c3. The problem was in that game, he eventually brought his bishop back to b3. Nakamura put a lot of pressure on his opponent. He eventually traded his knight for this bishop on b3. Topalav recaptured with his pawn here from the c2 square, and it just kind of unraveled from there. Topalav had a really hard time coming back from that, so decided not only for today, but even in the later games, because every time he played white yesterday in day 2, he played this same opening. But he played a little bit differently, and this is the first time that he's going for a queen to d2. So more than likely, he was thinking about it after his games yesterday, talking with his team as well, and decided that queen to d2 is the better variation for the style that he wants to be playing. Bishop to e7 from Nakamura, bishop e2. Bishop d7, castle on the queen side. Knight here, c6, just simple development, get involved into the middle of the board. Pawn to g3, really seeing this in all of the variations that Topalav is playing. Pawn b5, and then pawn a3. And this specific setup is what I think Topalav was getting after with his team. For the most part, the rest of the board state on both sides is exactly the other games that he had. The difference is where this light square bishop is, and then where this pawn is. You don't want to be playing your pawn up here to a3. If your bishop's here and your opponent already has their knight on a5 and they can exchange, then you have 2 pawns here on b3 and a3. It's just really difficult for white to continue here. So Topalav, I think, as they were studying, says, this is where I want to get to. So he continues. Pawn here to a3. Rook to c8. Always want to bring these rooks to semi-open files to control that. So now black says, yeah, if I'm going to castle, it's going to be to the king side of the board. King b1, knight a5. It's not doing as much as it was before, attacking the bishop on b3. So Topalav's fine with this. Pawn to h3, just solidifying this square here, control of the g4 square. Pawn g6, solidifying the pawn chain on the king side for black. Pawn g4 says, let's go ahead and break up this king side. I've already castled on the queen side, so I'm going to start throwing everything I can at the king side of the board. Pawn to e5. And then knight back here to b3. Says, yeah, I don't mind exchanging with my knights here. This is going to be completely fine. Decides not to do that right away. Bishop to e6. It's going to be extremely bad if there's not an exchange. happening fast. You know, white could take here on a5 if he wants. He could bring his knight back here to c1. Can't really just stay here because only one defender with the pawn, and both the knight and the bishop are attacking it. c1 seems a little bit too passive for me, and Topalav agrees. He decides to go ahead and take with his knight here on a5, and then the queen comes down and exchanges on a5. Topalav pushes pawn to g5, force the knight to move, knight d7, knight d5, queen takes here on d2, so we do see the queens come off the board. Bishop takes, rook recaptures. This is a nice little square for this rook here on d5. Can't be chased away by the dark square bishop that black has, and just controlling the center of the board right here. Pretty nice. Knight to c5, pawn to h4. Wants to make sure that this pawn's protected here on g5. Does have his bishop, but doesn't want that to be tied down to defending for the rest of the game. Castle on the king side, pawn to c3. Not sure I'm a huge fan of c3. If we look at what white's looking to do here, I think he's done a good job with his pawns on the king side of the board. He can start to change his approach to the queen side of the board. He could play rook to c1 if you want to push forward, pawn to c4. He could just automatically just push forward, pawn to c4. He could recapture with his bishop if he needs to, really control the center. Could play pawn up here c4 and then swing over with his rook to c1. Could play rook d1 and just load up here on the d file. I think he has a few options. Pawn c3, not one of my first choices. Knight here, e6, starting to attack a little bit more on this pawn on g5. Bishop down, d1, pawn f6, trying to break up those pawns. Rook down here, d2, pawn takes, pawn up here, b3, pinning down the knight on e6 to the king here. And then rook down here, c4 is a pretty interesting move from Nakamura, saying, yeah, I'm willing to give up this rook right here because, hey, I can have some pawn advantage over here on the king side of the board, and I think I like my chances with more pawns than you. So we see the bishop take here on a g5. The knight recaptures. Probably worse if he takes with his bishop here. Then a rook up here taking on d6. Still pinning down this rook here. Also threatening this knight. So does need to defend this knight. So maybe king f7. Pawn takes that bishop here on a g5. The knight takes. Now the bishop takes, and this is going to be, in my opinion, a fairly easy in-game for Topalav with good amount of pawns compared to his opponent. They're even, and he has two rooks compared to a rook and a knight. That's just easy pickings for white. So in the game, we see the knight take instead. And so after the pawn recaptures, now the rook can swing down here, take on f3. And it's a whole different ball game. Now we have 4 pawns in the center and the king side of the board compared to just these 2 for Topalav. Pawn to a4. So white's saying, hey, I need to attack on the queen side of the board. The king side's not going as I had planned. King to g7. Bishop takes that rook here on a c4. So we see the exchange. Now rook to d5. Great square for the rook on d5. It is going to be holding down this bishop on e7, or eventually the king could come over here and protect this pawn. But definitely a good square. Just needs to hold down the fort and make sure that his opponent especially doesn't get rid of this pawn here on g5 and then just push these pawns down on the king side of the board. He's not going to be able to swing the rest of his pieces over and protect that threat. Rook here to f8, king a2, rook over here b8, threatening this square here on b2, rook g2, trying to defend this square here on g5. So important. If this falls, it's going to be very, very difficult for Topalav to hold on. Nakamura continues, king f7 now that the queens are off the board, deciding he wants to get his king involved into the game. Rook down here, d2, still putting pressure, but recognizing that the king is going to start coming in, so wants to swing it over and try to control this open file on the f file. Rook to h8, decides, hey, if I want to start pushing forward on the king side, I can do that. King b1, pawn h4, king c2, pawn h3. And you can see Nakamura, this is going to be difficult for white to deal with. It's going to be difficult to really push this the entire way because it is a light square that this pawn's going to. If he had a light square bishop, this would be much easier, but he's not going to be able to defend this square with his bishop. So because of that, Topalav can stop this. It's just more of a nuisance that he even has to worry about this. He would like to really be attacking his opponent instead of worrying about this passed pawn. Rook to h2, trying to stop that, but what's nice, since this pawn's come down to the third rank, now the rook can come down h4, attack this pawn. Then he has a passed pawn on the e-file, really starting to put a lot of pressure on his opponent. So rook to g3 says, yeah, I'm going to give you that pawn. I'll take this passed pawn over here on h3 so I don't have to worry about it. Nakamura says, yeah, that's fine with me. I'm going to go ahead and attack in the center. I think that's going to be more of a pain for you to deal with. Rook takes on h3, pawn d5, rook up here h6, attacking the pawn. King f5, defending that square. So Nakamura doing a good job of using his king to stop any sort of attack. Rook here to h7, attacking the bishop. Bishop takes on g5. You can start to see the huge attack that Nakamura has with his pawns after the bishop takes. Rook to f7, forcing the king to move, or the bishop really only has two moves. Bishop comes back here, or king to e6. I think this is probably worse, just disconnects his pieces, and this could really just stop the king from coming over here from the 7th or from the f file. So decides to go ahead and just block that with his bishop here on f6, and then pawn a5. Nakamura responds with rook down e2 check. King d1, rook here to f2. Wants to make sure that his opponent doesn't do anything with rook to f3, forcing the king to move, and then potentially taking this bishop or just putting him in a weird position. So rook to f2 does stop that. King e1, attacking the rook, and then rook up to f4, buys him a few moves if the king wants to start coming up here on the e-file. Decides not to do that. Rook to g2 and then d4. Black starts to gain some space here and starts to push his pawns right here. And then white has a few options. He really needs to be looking at this and saying, all right, I've got to deal with the center of the board. I have two rooks. Those are the strongest pieces into the endgame compared to a rook and a bishop. But I can't let my opponent dominate with the pawns in the center of the board. That's really Black's main advantage that he has. So he needs to be playing something like, yeah, pawn takes here on d4. Pawn recaptures, that's fine. Rook to c7, attacking this pawn right here. This one is going to fall. And so from there, I think white's going to have a pretty good game. Unfortunately, Topalav decides it's not as important to defend the center, and he plays rook to a7, attacking this pawn. The game's just not about this pawn here on a6. From here, we see pawn to d3, pushing that advantage. Anytime you have a passed pawn, always good to push that. The rook takes on a6, sure. But then black actually lets white come back in. He plays pawn to e4. Nakamura, I think, missed the move bishop to h4. This kind of buys him some time. He can always play pawn to e4 if he wants to, but this gets the bishop out of the way. His opponent will have to move now, and then he can play pawn to e4, so his bishop is in the attack, doesn't have to worry about it ever being attacked by this rook here on a6. So much better move, kind of an in-between move. Anytime you are in a chess game and you find a good move, see if you can improve that position before you actually do that move. And especially if you can put your opponent in check, a lot of times that will allow you to get into that position. So Nakamura plays pawn to e4. Not the best move. Really from here you could see the best move would be rook takes on f6. And then if the king were to decide to take here, then rook to f2. And just says, okay, that rook is going to fall. Even if the pawn comes here to d2, that's fine. Rook over here to d2. If we see an exchange on board, maybe the rook takes and then the king takes here on f2. This king can stop these pawns pushing here, And then we're just going to see this pawn push over here on the A file. So this is going to be good for white. These players don't have a ton of time. That's one of the things you see in the blitz style games. They really can't calculate it. Is this going to be a really good move if I decide to take the bishop here? I have 2 rooks. My opponent has a rook and a bishop. Should I take this? I'm not sure. Decides not to calculate that. Instead, just play rook to c6. Doesn't really understand the threat that's on board, so wants to start chipping away at the pawns. Unfortunately for Topalav, that's definitely not good because pawn to e3, it just gets away from him. There's no way to really stop the threat here. Rook to c5, trying to check his opponent, but it doesn't matter. It's too little, too late. King to e6, rook up here to c6, king d6 or d7, attacking the rook. The rook's going to have to move, and then the pawns can push freely and eventually end up winning the game. There's just no way for white to stop this. So all in all, Nakamura, great game from him. Topalav struggling at this point, down 4 games after the first game. Day 2 and 3 coming out the gates, prepared, playing the e4, meeting the Sicilian defense, the Najdorf defense, had a very specific way he wanted to go about that with f3 early on, castle on the queen side, but both the variations he's tried just not working too well for him. Exciting game nonetheless, and seeing a lot of great chess going on from all of our matches, all of our competitors. Hopefully you're enjoying the tournament, and I will see you tomorrow for some more coverage.